In the 8 months after Scotland made it a crime to kill a beaver, 87 were shot. 1 in 5 of every beaver known to be alive in Tayside. Every killing legal, every licence signed by the agency that protects them. Pete Creech watched the first 11 come out of wooden crates in 2009. They had 5 years to prove they belonged before ministers decided whether beavers stayed in Britain at all. He is still out there counting what's left. If you've been told rewilding is a good news story, this is the half that gets left out. I'm Ambrose Wild. Those 87 were not killed by poachers. They were shot on farmland by people holding government licences, signed by the same agency that had spent a decade arguing beavers belonged in Scotland. How that became routine starts on a wet morning in Argyll, with 3 wooden crates at the edge of a loch. Watch for one thing as we go. There is a pattern running underneath all of this that has nothing to do with beavers, and it turns up 3 times. I'll say what it is at the end. You will probably get there before I do. The animals in those crates had been through more process than most people who emigrate. 11 Eurasian beavers, trapped in Norway, held in quarantine in Devon for 6 months, health screened and tagged before one of them touched Scottish water. Reaching that morning had taken more than a decade of feasibility work, a rejected application and a licence from the Scottish Government. On the 28th and 29th of May 2009, 3 families went into 3 freshwater lochs inside Knapdale Forest in mid-Argyll. It was the first authorised reintroduction of a mammal anywhere in Britain, and Simon Jones, who managed the trial, was working to terms with nowhere to hide. Every dam, every felled tree and every kit born would be logged by independent monitors, then handed to ministers. Pete Creech monitors that forest for the Heart of Argyll Wildlife Organisation. 15 years on, he can walk you to the exact water. Most of this story is visible from where he stands. The first thing the beavers did was ignore the plan. They had been put into Loch Coil Bar, 33 hectares of open water. Within months, one family walked away from it. They moved to a pond called the Dubh Loch, less than half a hectare, dark and shallow and closed in by oak and birch, and they dammed its outflow. A beaver dam is not really built, it is grown over time. They cut willow and birch at the waterline, drag the timber in, wedge it against whatever will hold, then pack the gaps with mud and stone scooped off the bottom with their forepaws. After that, they never stop. Every night they walk the length of it, find where it is leaking, and pack it again. Running water is the trigger. If a beaver can hear it moving, the beaver will go and close it. The water came up by more than a metre. It spread sideways into the woodland, drowned the roots of standing trees, and turned dry forest floor into shallow, flooded ground full of dead timber, which is the richest condition there is in British fresh water, and one a managed landscape almost never makes. The aerial photographs of the Dubh Loch tell it without commentary. In 2008, it is a small, dark pond in a wood. By 2015, it is a sheet of water pushing back into the trees. By 2018, it has turned into something the literature has a name for, a beaver meadow. Creech describes what he finds in there. Thrushes flipping over beaver-cut wood chips to get at the insects underneath. Early spring flies gathering on birch stumps that are bleeding sap. Herons and little grebes fishing pools that did not exist. Teal dabbling through dam material the beavers had added a few hours earlier. Surveyors from the British Dragonfly Society found hairy dragonflies and beautiful demoiselles working the small, sunlit clearings the beavers opened up by felling trees. The same surveyors noted that dragonfly numbers looked to be falling. At one loch, the animals had changed heavily, which is the sort of finding that goes missing when this story gets told. So 11 animals had 5 years to make the case for their entire species, and they made it. 9 years after the monitoring stopped, the state started shooting them. The case they made travelled on one number. In 2021, hydrologists at the University of Exeter published work on beaver dams at 4 British sites, built out of more than 1,000 separate storm events. Dam sequences reduced peak flows consistently, and in the largest storms they measured, flood flows fell by up to around 60%. 60%. That figure is why beavers stopped being a conservation project and became flood policy, quoted in council reports and parliamentary debates across Britain. Here is what does not get quoted alongside it. Those measurements came off small streams in southwest England, not Scottish river systems. And when the same group looked at how the effect scaled with the size of the storm, they were careful to state the limit. Above roughly the 97th percentile of rainfall, attenuation could not be confidently detected. The effect is real and measurable, right up to the storms that actually put water into people's fields. And there the data runs out. Hold on to that, because it comes back. It comes back because of what beavers do to farmland. Adrian Ivory farms in Perthshire. In evidence gathered for a Scottish Government report on beaver welfare, his losses from beaver-related crop flooding and the labour of dealing with it were put at around £4,000 a year and £50,000 in total. The same report records another Tayside grower losing £25,000 of vegetables when his land went under. The damage is not really the dams. Duncan McAllister of NFU Scotland has set out how it actually works. Beavers tunnel into the flood banks that hold a river off the fields. The bank goes hollow from the inside. Nothing looks wrong from the top of it. Then a storm surge arrives. The whole length gives way at once, and the water does not stop politely at the field margin. Around 15% of Scottish land is decent farming ground, and a much smaller share of that grows the crops that reach supermarket shelves without processing. That is exactly the ground beavers want, because it is flat and wet and sitting next to a river. There was no compensation scheme. There was no agreed way of even recording what was being lost. In November 2016, ministers confirmed beavers would stay. On the 1st of May 2019, the beaver became a European protected species in Scotland, which made killing one a criminal offence. Protection arrived with a licensing system, because farmers needed a remedy and nobody had a better answer. In the 8 months that followed, NatureScot issued licences under which 87 beavers were shot, roughly a fifth of the known population in the Tay and Forth. The year after that, a further 115. The Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, which had helped bring the animals back, said publicly that control on that scale put their conservation status in question. The charity Trees for Life took NatureScot to the Court of Session, arguing the agency was not treating killing as a last resort. Now put the two halves of this together. Those beavers were shot because they flood farmland. The reason Scotland was keeping beavers at all was that they reduce flooding, on the strength of a 60% figure measured on small English streams, which stops being measurable at exactly the storm sizes that burst a Perthshire flood bank. Scotland was shooting them for causing floods on ground where it had never been able to prove they prevented any, and almost none of the animals being shot had been put there on purpose. Somebody, at some point in the 2000s, put beavers into the River Tay. No licence, no quarantine, no study. Nobody knows who did it, and nobody has ever been charged. And for more than 13 years, those animals had no legal status of any kind, which meant anyone whose land they turned up on could deal with them however they wanted. The shooting did not begin in 2019. In 2019, it simply began being counted. They were not Norwegian. Genetic work traced them to Germany, most likely to the mixed founder stock of Bavaria, which means they came out of a private collection or an enclosure rather than a Scandinavian river. Somebody drove them east, opened a box, and walked away. By 2012, they were plainly established and breeding, and the Minister for Environment had a decision to make. Removing them would have been expensive, unpopular, and probably impossible. So the Scottish Government chose to tolerate them and to study them alongside the legal ones. The surveys since have measured what that produced. Around 400 beavers in the Tay catchment by 2018, close to 1,000 3 years after that, spreading into the Forth, into Fife, into the middle of Perth. Meanwhile, in Argyll, the licensed experiment was quietly failing. Across the whole trial, 16 beavers were released at Napdale, and 14 kits were born there. By the time monitoring ended in May 2014, Simon Jones and his colleagues were looking at roughly 8 surviving reintroduced animals and perhaps 1 or 2 born in the wild. £1 million of landfill tax funding, 5 years of independent science, a decade of process before that, and the population was not secure. So in 2017, the partners went back in to reinforce it. The beavers they used were trapped in Tayside, out of the population nobody had permission to create, with NatureScot paying for the trapping. Sit with the arithmetic of those years. In the east, the state was signing licenses to shoot beavers in the Tay catchment. In the west, the state was paying to catch beavers in the Tay catchment, drive them across the country, and put them into its own flagship project, because that project could not survive on the animals it had imported legally from Norway. The beavers Pete Creech watches at Napdale today are largely Bavarian. They are descended from whatever somebody let out of the back of a van 2 decades ago, and the genetics of that forest are now a Norwegian and Bavarian mix that exists nowhere else in Britain. Nobody planned that. It is what was left once everyone had finished reacting, which is the pattern, and you have probably had it for a while. Every decision in this story arrived after the thing it was deciding about had already happened. A minister agreed in 2012 to keep animals that were already there. Protection in 2019 covered animals that arrived illegally. The rescue in 2017 saved the legal project using the illegal one. Nobody was ever ahead of it. Scotland did not decide to bring beavers back. It kept catching up with people who had not waited, and with animals that were never going to. Pete Creech is still out there counting. The Dubh Loch is still spreading into the trees. If you want more of these, the ones where the official version turns out to be the smaller half of what actually happened, that's what this channel does. There are more coming. I'm Ambrose Wild.